Hello and welcome back to the What Did He Mean by That podcast. I'm here with Dr. Christopher Cali, Pastor John North, Ashley Cali, and I'm Robby McKinney. This past weekend, Pastor Chris preached on natural and moral evil in the world. Join us today as we dig into the message.
So we have Robby back from his cruising the Gulf of America. How was that? Were you in the Gulf of America?
I was in the Gulf of America. I felt very patriotic on the Gulf of America on my way to Mexico. So,
He's American Canal.
You're Scottish, right?
I am, yeah, Scottish and Irish.
Descent, so your skin is whiter than when you left to go to the sun. So,
well, thanks. I avoided the sun pretty hard.
And then Pastor Chris's wife Kara had their baby Theo this week.
Theo Christopher Heimerly.
Yeah, so he is out on maternity leave.
Paternity leave.
Paternity leave. And so we got Pastor John with us to go over the weekend message. So let's jump in.
All right. So now that Pastor Chris Heimerly is not here to ask questions, I'm going to try to create one.
Female perspective.
From a female perspective. No, but in all honesty, you answered the why this week, which I don't want to jump right to that. But I like how you got there. And you didn't get there to the end, but you reminded the congregation about what they've been learning in John so far. And you used the story of Nicodemus. So would you just want to elaborate on how you pulled in what they're already learning, the context of prior, right?
Yeah.
To explain the why of suffering through John 3.
Yeah, and I think we picked up in the Nicodemus passage, kind of giving a context to the verse, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only son," and remembering that this was a situation where Nicodemus, like a chief religious leader, one of the Pharisees, was coming to Jesus, and we talked about the idea that we need to frame the conversation correctly, and it's a biblical frame. So this isn't a philosophical conversation about evil and suffering. This is, what does the Bible say about evil and suffering? In our secular world, we would want to deny the existence of God because of evil and suffering. And if you remember 2 weeks ago, we talked about, I think it was David Hume, that false dilemma of, well, the creature's not happy, so God must not really exist, or at least he's not all-powerful because he's not making his creature happy. And, you know, the fact that if we're framing this in a biblical context, it's a totally different answer why evil and suffering here is here. Evil and suffering comes from the hand, all of it, good and bad, the Bible tells us, comes from the hand of a sovereign God. So in some way, God allows or purposes evil and suffering in our world, even though he is a good God and is not the author of evil and suffering. And so with the biblical context, we came back to Nicodemus and his seeking out Jesus in the middle of the night, and recognizing that he saw Nicodemus saw that Jesus had a power over the natural evil in our world, and he concluded that in that power that Jesus had over the natural evil of our world, that he was sent from God, being powerful over moral evil also in a traditional Pharisaical theology. So we talked about that, and then Jesus kind of flips the script on him and walks against the works righteousness mentality of the Pharisees and says, well, you must be born again. And then he begins to illustrate what it is to be born again by talking about Moses lifting up the serpent, the statue of the serpent in the wilderness, and saying, I'm going to be lifted up just like that serpent, and those who look on me will be saved. And he preaches, if not the first time in the New Testament, we see the preaching of the gospel of Jesus Christ by himself to Nicodemus. And in that context, he says to Nicodemus, for God so loved this world, and he exclaims the love of God that the Father has for a fallen world that's sinning against him. So that being the broader context to where's evil and suffering come from. Did I kind of go where you wanted me to go there?
Yeah.
That was very long-winded.
My question I was thinking of in relation with talking about Nicodemus and Jesus, and you talk about kind of Nicodemus's struggle, right? Where it's so countercultural for him, right? That it's like, hey, I lived my whole life, giving everything to living my way in this life. And here, we don't have an indication of exactly how old Nicodemus is, but he's lived probably a lot of years.
Yeah.
And now Jesus is right. And
Definitely.
he's lived his whole life, and now Jesus comes and kind of turns his world upside down. And you can see like that wrestling match taking place, right? Like this is you can see Nicodemus wanting to believe, but it's also, this goes against everything I've lived my whole life. What do you think, and for anyone, like, what do you think today's struggles for people are? Because I think a lot of people have a similar reaction that Nicodemus it can't be that, Jesus. It can't be that easy. It can't be like I have to contribute something. Do you see that there's other obstacles that, like, modern day 2,000 years later, that we kind of come up against, that people are like, well, it can't be that easy. It can't be that.
Yeah, it's I think it's the same struggle. It's our default, and it's the same default that Nicodemus has, because we all look at the world around us and we look at our own lives and we recognize that something's not right. Something's wrong, and evil's a part of that. Suffering's a part of that. It's not, we don't look at our lives and see the blessings in our lives and say something's wrong.
Right.
Yeah. We look at our lives and we see the evidence of the fall, difficulty, struggle, suffering, evil, and we say something's wrong. And then our natural inclination is exactly what Nicodemus's is. If I'm not blessed and happy, it's David Hume, then I'm not doing something right, because the way that we're blessed and happy in our lives is by doing the right thing. It's what we've all been brought up on, right? I mean, think of school. Think of being a child, being from the point we're an infant to the time we go to elementary school. Our parents are training us to know the right thing gets us blessing, the wrong thing gets us punishment.
Right.
We get into school, right thing blessing, wrong thing punishment. Nicodemus's theology, right thing blessing, wrong thing punishment. And in a sense, that's right?
Yep.
Because we see it all through the Bible. But the gospel is that we didn't have the ability to do the right thing, only Christ did. And it was always a faith. Even in the Old Testament, God recognized that the people weren't doing the right thing. Justification by faith didn't come just through Paul. It came through the book of Habakkuk.
Right.
It was always by faith. The remnant was always ones that were people of faith. But that's really what Jesus is explaining to Nicodemus. So I think our struggle is no different than Nicodemus is.
Yeah.
We consistently and constantly recognize the idea that the right thing is you gain a blessing from God. The wrong thing is punishment from God. And then you start to see where the Bible begins to break that down. Because everyone's got to recognize, in a sense, that's right.
Right. Yeah.
In a sense, that's right. We don't enter into salvation by doing the right thing. That's through faith.
Exactly.
But then God displays for us the way he wants us to live, and we live according to the way God wants us to live. And in that, we gain a blessing. And when we sin, we experience the consequences of that. But the conclusion that those are always right is the wrong conclusion. And you see that with the book of Job, and you see that with the man born blind in the book of John. The disciples come to Jesus and say, who sinned that this guy was born blind, the parents or the kid? And Jesus' answer is what? Neither. You're making a false conclusion here.
Yep.
And what Jesus, and in the book of Job, it wasn't Job's sin. This was, and both of those were for God's glory and God's exaltation. So again, to answer your question, John, I think I did, and then I expanded on the fact that suffering isn't always, you can't look at your life and say, well, I'm suffering. There must be a direct connection to some sin that I have in my life that if I just fix this sin, then the suffering will go away. There is a connection, and there's an ultimate connection, but not all suffering is a direct result of some sin that you have in your life also. You have to have discernment in that whole thing.
Well, and it also goes to, where it's a higher view of man and a wrong view of God and his attributes.
Yeah.
And it started back in the garden with the fall, like you talked about, but like you're talking about today and what we struggle with. And in the women's group right now, we're doing Mama Bear apologetics, and they're talking about self-helpism. And I mean, that's what happened in the garden with Eve. It's this inclination of, I know what's better for me. I know what's good for me. And if I don't have this, back to the biblical perspective, but also understanding how you talked about at the end that like God is other than. So when we view ourselves as we're doing better and we see better, we don't view our sin as bad as it is when it's up to a holy God. If I just think adding that.
I think a lot of times when we start a relationship with Christ or try to understand how his love is for us, it's just we have to be humbled because it is not about us. The fear of having to let go of the good or the bad or earn my way to heaven, having to let go of it's not in my control at all.
Yeah.
My sins don't necessarily justify these reactions or anything that is so self-evaluating of yourself. You have to be able to let that go and remember that we serve a big God who is so much bigger than us. There's things happening that are so much grander, and the grand scheme of things, what I do with my life does not determine how God is going to act.
Yeah.
He is way bigger than us.
Yeah,
his sacrifice was for all of us.
Yeah.
And so we have to put ourselves behind and trust that God loved me despite of what I am.
And that's really the only way you can actually deal with real suffering in your life, is to recognize that God is other than.
Yeah.
And that, I mean, we're going to start to move now, this series of why is there evil and suffering. We're going to start to illustrate John 3:19 and 21 with the life of Joseph. And this weekend, we're going to go right to the end of the story, and where Joseph is with his brothers after the whole thing takes place, and his brothers are scared because they were the ones that sold him into slavery.
Right.
And he says to them, he makes a statement, what you meant for evil, God meant for good. And you see this dynamic in that statement that God's sovereignty is over all, even the evil actions of men. And that doesn't mean that men aren't responsible for their actions. It doesn't mean that God somehow makes us robots, but it means that God is sovereign over our evil actions, even though we don't understand how that works, right?
Yeah.
And now as we push back into it, we begin to understand exactly what you're saying, Robby, is that to understand all of the evil and suffering of the world in the best possible way that we can, the only way we're really going to do that is by understanding who God is.
Yep.
And everything else is secondary to who God is, because all that we receive and experience in this life comes from the hand of God, and it comes from the character of God and who he is in Trinitarian relationship between Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Everything that we experience, if it's love, if it's wrath, if it's justice, if it's suffering, if it's everything, we can't somehow take evil and suffering and say, nope, that's not my loving God, and put it outside God. That's not how it works. And so that's why I push back into, as I came to the end of the message, that we took the first, if you think about it, we took the first message in the series and 90% of the second message in the series to talk about who God was. And then we ended with, well, if God's not the author of evil, how did evil get into our world? And even we couched that conversation with who God is as immutable, if you remember. God's unchanging.
Right.
And so you always have to couch everything with who God is first, and then how it affects mankind.
Yep.
And so we push back into God's attribute of immutability. God does not change. He never changes, but we don't share that attribute with God. And so how does evil and suffering, what is the roadmap to which it entered our world if God is not the author of it? Well, it was the fact that he created a creature that was not like him, that was less than him, that was changing. And like Augustine said, God created Adam with the ability to obey or not obey. And that's what the Bible tells us. When passion, right? That's how sin is birthed, right? Sin is birthed through our desires, and our desires turn into passions, and our passions result in sin. Right? So we have this desire in our life, and Adam and Eve had a desire to eat of the fruit. And the desire turned into a passion, and we all relate to this. Passions make us stupid. They overcome our logic. They overcome the thing that we know is the thing that we shouldn't be doing or we should be doing. And that's what happened to Adam and Eve. It's what happens to you and me. And that passion, when it's acted upon, they chose to eat the fruit, birth sin. And through one man's sin, death came to us all, and suffering and evil. And that's why we push back to Romans. Now all the creation is groaning and awaiting for the reconciliation of God, where God redeems all things unto himself and then sets everything right once again.
Well, and that's another lens that you have to put on to deal with suffering, was how you brought in Romans 8. And it's that perspective that, yeah, suffering in this world may stink, but it's the glory that is to be revealed to us, that heaven is what should be on our forefront, where when we're going through this suffering, the reason we can get through it is because we know that this world is not our home. And having that perspective, along with everything else that you said, I think also helps someone get through suffering, because this isn't it for you.
And I'll end the podcast with this, because I think that's probably the most important point. For all the people that listen to the podcast, I'd encourage you to go read Romans 9. It's going to be a tough passage to read, but what you're going to recognize in Romans 9 is that, again, God is supreme in this whole thing. And we would never understand how good he is. This is an extremely hard statement for someone, especially someone that has suffered intensely in their life. And I recognize that. But you would never understand grace and mercy if there was not judgment. You would never understand goodness and love if there wasn't suffering and evil. And in some mysterious way, a good, all-powerful God designed the world to be that way. Ultimately, his purpose was that evil and suffering would enter our world, because he saw a world where Jesus was redeeming us is better than a world not. And I know that's extremely hard. That's probably stretching people's mind. It makes it very hard to understand. But the glory that you're going to experience, isn't that what we started the whole message with? The glory that you're going to experience, and you are experiencing through the redemption of Jesus Christ in your life, the glory of Jesus Christ, the grace and the mercy and the love. One day you're going to look back in eternity and you're going to say, it doesn't even compare with the suffering I'm experiencing in this life.
Thanks for listening to the What Did He Mean by That podcast. We hope today's conversation was insightful and encouraging. We would love to see you on the weekends at 6 p.m. on Saturday and 9 and 11 a.m. on Sunday. Have a great week.